Hello, it is the evening of December 30th, and I just finished reading Normal People by Sally Rooney, which is the 52nd book that I have read in the year 2021. Now, I don't think I'm going to be able to finish any other books in the next 24 hours or whatever, so I think I'm going to call it. In the year 2021, I read 52 books. Now, considering that in 2019 and 2020 combined, I think I read a total of 7 books. Reading 52 books is a huge level up for me. And I'm definitely going to film and release a video talking about the sort of actionable steps that I took to become a more consistent and better reader. Because I know a lot of people like to make New Year's resolutions to read more, and that can sometimes be really hard if you're not in the habit of reading to suddenly become a consistent reader. So I'll definitely be posting that video of sort of tips and advice in my own journey, probably within the next week or so that it can kind of help guide you in the new year. But what I wanted to do here now in 2021 still is take a sort of macro overview look at all of the books that I read in 2021 and come up with some stats about them. Because in the same way that I kind of think that it's important to sometimes take a step back and examine your beauty consumption habits, I also think it's important to sometimes take a step back and examine media consumption habits, right? What kinds of books are you reading? What kinds of shows are you watching? Whose voices are you giving preference to or not? So coming from a place of just curiosity and non-judgment, I decided to take the last 30 minutes to take a look through all of the books that I read that are on STORYGRAPH and also do a little bit of extra research to come up with a couple stats that I think are important for me to track by myself. Hopefully this will just be a short, sweet, informative little video to close the year out. So without any further ado, let's get it. Okay, so I have here my little Hobonichi planner in which I sort of took a couple pages to write down all of my reading stats. So if you see me kind of looking down like this or reading off the page, that's what I'm doing because I don't know these things off the top of my head. But like I was saying, I read 52 books total in the year 2021, and according to STORYGRAPH, that is 16,189 pages. Of the 52 books, 39 were fiction, so that's 75%. 12 were nonfiction, that's 23%, and then I read 1 poetry book, so that's 2%. 8 of the books were translated texts, meaning that the original book wasn't published in English, and that represents 15% of my overall reading. Taking a moment to sort of reflect on those stats, I think I'm a little disappointed by how few translated books I read. I would hope that at least a quarter of my reading, right? So 25 as opposed to 15% would be translated books. Because I really think it's important to genuinely understand voices from the global south. And while I understand that a lot of the global south is part of the Anglosphere because the British Empire and colonialism, hello, I grew up in Nepal, which is an Asian country, and yet all of my schooling was conducted in English. So while I understand that there are plenty of authors in the global south that are writing in English, I think that a lot of those authors tend to be people who are at the upper echelons of their society, because it takes a certain level of privileged education to be writing a book in English if you are not from a dominantly English-speaking country. And I think you can just get a wider and more diverse range of voices by choosing to read translated fiction. So yeah, I think in the future I would like to read a lot more translated fiction. Keeping on in terms of book statistics as opposed to author statistics, according to the STORYGRAPH, my average star rating is 4.08, which meant that I had just an amazing and exceptional reading year. The lowest rated book I read was 2.5 stars. It was The Love Hypothesis. If you haven't seen my rant review about it, I will link it up in the cards for you. But I will say that I only ranked 6 books 5 stars. So that's a little bit over 10%. It's not a lot. So even though I had an exceptionally good reading year, my average rating was 4 stars. I only gave 6 books 5-star ratings. I'm just realizing maybe I should take a moment here to explain a little bit how I personally choose to rate books. So 1, I don't use Goodreads anymore. I use the STORYGRAPH, and the STORYGRAPH actually gives you the opportunity to give books half and quarter star ratings. So I'm actually going to post up here a screenshot of the spread of all of my ratings so that you can see them. And I will, I think, film a video where I go through each of the 52 books I read and then rate them individually. But as I hope you can see from the graph, a lot of the books that I read fell in the 4, 4.25, 4.5, even 4.75 star rating. And the distinction for me between a 4.75 0.75 5-star book and a 5-star book is that while both books I would say like completely knocked my socks off, 5-star books are books that I just like keep coming back to. And I kind of like circle back around to them so frequently that I want to reread the book. So even if a book is like the Lady Gaga gif, right, where as I'm reading it, I'm like incredible, show-stopping, brilliant, talented, never the same, like even if a book makes me feel that way, if when I'm done reading the book, I don't ever have a desire to like reread the book again, I won't give it 5 stars. I will give it a 4.75 stars. So 5-star books are books which I'm just like, oh, I just figured out the perfect way to explain what a 5-star book is. A 5-star book to me is a book which like lives rent-free inside my head, right? If you are not living rent-free inside my head, like a full month after I have finished reading you, like you are not a 5-star book in my personal opinion. You could have blown my mind and I will give you the 4.75. But for me, the 5-star is you were so good and interesting that you live rent-free inside my brain. And that's why I'm actually one of those people who I will like frequently go back and change my star rating, right? Like I'll give a book 4.5 stars or even 4.75 stars. And then like 3 months later, I'll come back and be like, nah, bitch, you were a 5-star. You deserved. I cannot stop thinking about you. I lay awake at night and I'm like, damn, you were really that good. And so you deserve your flowers. I'm going to give you the full 5-star. For now, some of you might be like, girl, that's really dramatic. That's really stringent, but like whatever, like it's my rating system. You know, I think each person should have the right to sort of have their own individualized rating system and organizational system. And one of the reasons why I absolutely love the STORYGRAPH is that it allows me to sort of give granularity in my ratings of books. Because to me, there is a difference between a 4.5-star book and like a 5-star book. And I want to kind of be able to express that instead of like rounding up a 4.5 or 4.75 star book to 5 stars, the way Goodreads would have always made me do. Like for me personally, I think the star rating system is like not necessarily super valuable to other people. I think a written review or like an oral review is actually really valuable in terms of like informing other people whether or not they should or should not read a book. I think for me, the way the star rating has always worked is that it is like an internal cataloging system for my own brain so that I know in the pantheon of all the books that I've read, like where does this book fall? Let's get back to like the actual stats. The shortest book I read was the one poetry book, There Are More Beautiful Things Than Beyonce by Morgan Parker. That was 85 pages long. Other short books that I read that were not that poetry book were Ghachar by Vivek Shanbhag. That was 118 pages. And then The Turn of the Screw by Henry James, which is like a novella. It was 121 pages. The absolute longest book that I read was Dombey and Son, which came in at 1,058 pages. Oh, I just realized I actually read 53 books this year, but that 53rd book, it wasn't like a proper published translation of a book. It was like an illegal fan-made translation of the Mo Xiang Tong novel, The Scum Villain Self-Saving System. And that was actually like 1,200 pages long. But it's not like an official published book. Like they are only just now publishing an official authorized translation in volumes. And I did read the first volume of that. I'm going to do like a whole review of Scum Villain later because that book fucking lives rent-free in my head, but not in a positive way. But either way, so technically I read like 53 books and my longest book actually was The Scum Villain Self-Saving System, that illegal ass like shady translation that was done by a group of fans on the internet and which ended up being like 1,200 pages long. But yeah, according to the STORYGRAPH, the longest legit book I read was Dombey and Son. So those are all of the book stats. What I've also done is I've taken a look at the authors that I've read this year and then done like a very like brief, vague, rough demographic breakdown, right? Like I am not the race police. So like if there are slight inconsistencies in this, that's fine. I also want to note here that while I did do a demographic breakdown by gender, race, and then also geography, I did not do one by sexual orientation because there are a lot of authors who are like not out. Also, it just like doesn't sit right to me to be like trying to furiously Google who is like gay and who is straight and who's a lesbian and like whatnot. So in the last like 30-40 minutes when I was like looking up the author's demographic data, I made a very deliberate and conscious choice to not include sexual orientation because it's like people deserve the right to privacy. So this is just like a very sort of rough demographic breakdown to give me a sense of like who have I been reading this past year? I am not the diversity police. I just have an interest in reading diversely. And so I'm curious to see like, well, how diversely did I read? Especially when I'm not like actively trying, right? Because it wasn't like I was like, oh, I should make an effort to read more like Latin American authors, or I should read more Asian authors, or I should read more Black authors. I just kind of picked up whatever the hell was interesting sounding to me and I ran with it. So when I did that, like, what happened? Where am I reading from? That's kind of the purpose of this sort of demographic breakdown. So, having said that, for the 52 books, there were actually 55 authors total. 24 of the 55 authors were male, so that is 43.6%. 29 were female, so that is 52.7%, and then 2 were non-binary, so that's 3.6%. And just so you know, I should have probably prefaced this at the start of the video, but if like percents don't add up to 100, it's because of a rounding error. I do know how to do math. But yeah, so that's interesting. I actually ended up reading more women than men and 2 non-binary authors, which is like not bad. I believe the 2 were Casey McQuiston and Akwaeke Emezi. Regarding the sort of like racial breakdown, so there was 1 mixed race author, so that's 2%. And that was, again, I think Akwaeke Emezi, who is half Nigerian and half Tamil. And the way that I dealt with like mixed race authors, in this case, it would just be like Akwaeke Emezi, for example, because they are half Black and half Asian, I put a tally mark in both Black and Asian. In terms of the racial breakdowns of authors, I'm going to go in sort of like descending order from the demographic that I read the absolute most from down to the demographic that I read like nothing from. So I read 24 white authors in 2021, so that is 43% of my overall reading. 18 Black authors, so that is 33% of my overall reading. 9 Asian authors, 16%. 3 Latinx authors, so that's 5%. 2 Middle Eastern and North African authors, that's 4%. And by the way, in MENA, I also include Israel. And then, embarrassing, but I read 0 works by Indigenous authors. So obviously 0%. So in terms of like reflection, not great that I read absolutely 0 books by Indigenous authors. And you know what's funny is like I did actually, like back there, I bought a book called A History of My Brief Body by Billy Ray Belcourt, who is an Indigenous Canadian author. I haven't gotten around to reading it. And literally like over there in my library stack is Stephen Graham Jones's The Only Good Indians, but I haven't gotten around to reading that either. So while I don't feel like super great about having read 0 Indigenous authors, like I know that probably in the month of like January itself, I'm going to end up reading like 2 Indigenous authors. It was just kind of like a question of timing because I only ordered the Billy Ray Belcourt book in December, and The Only Good Indians also only came in December. I think the thing that like surprised me is that I still read so many goddamn white authors. Like, white authors really by themselves took up 43% of all of the authors that I read in 2021, which is like staggering to me. So while I did like relatively okay in terms of gender parity, in fact, I like overcorrected, I read more women than I read men, my reading overall was still pretty solidly white. I think the other thing that kind of surprised me is that I only read 9 Asian authors. And this is why I think doing like actual stats breakdowns is like really revealing, because if you asked me whether I read more Black literature or more Asian literature, before today I would have told you I read a lot more Asian literature than I do Black literature. Right? When it's like in actuality, I read twice as many books by Black authors than I did by Asian authors in 2021. So this assertion that I think I read a lot of Asian literature, it's just not true, right? And perhaps the only reason why I feel that way is that like in comparison to the standard sort of like white booktuber, I do read more Asian literature than them. But that's because they just don't read very much Asian literature at all. Who'd have thought? And then the last sort of like demographic piece that I wanted to keep track of was geography, right? Because I think it's important to read perspectives from all around the world. And while you might be like, okay, but Prachi, like you already kept track of race. Well, the reality is like the experience of, let's say like an Asian American person is very different from the experience of an actual Asian person living in Asia. The experience of a Black person living in the US is different from a Black person living in the Caribbean, is different from the experience of a Black person living in Africa. And when I think about like reading diversely, I'm not just thinking in terms of like racial diversity, I'm also thinking in terms of geographic diversity. Because of like, yeah, sure, okay, right, 33% of the books that I read were by Black authors, but were they all by Black American or Canadian authors? Did I read anybody from Africa at all? Did I read anybody from South America? Did I read anybody from Asia? Like, am I reading people from the global South? Or am I reading the voices of people from the global South who have migrated and half assimilated into the global North? You know, like that is like a question that I'm curious to find out the answer to. So for geographic data, I basically kind of looked at like where authors are from. So for example, somebody like Basi Ikpi, she was born and raised in Nigeria, but then she moved to the United States. And so for her, I put down a mark in both Africa and North America. If on the other hand, Basi had Nigerian parents, but was born and raised in the United States, I would have only put down a mark for North America. Hopefully that makes sense for kind of like how I did this breakdown. But if you have any questions, you can ask me and I'll do my best to try and answer them. Anyway, here is the geographical breakdown in sort of like descending order. So 32 of the books that I read were by North Americans. That is a whopping 56% of all texts that I read. The next major continent that I read from was Europe. 13 of the books that I read were by Europeans, so that is 23% of all of the books that I read. That makes a grand total of 79%, so almost 80% of all of the books that I read were from the global North. And then 6 books I read were Asian, that is 10% of my reading. 3 books I read had like authors of African origin, so that's 5%. I read 1 book each from the continents of South America and Australia. And then I also kind of separated out the Caribbean, because the Caribbean is technically part of North America, but it's like not really part of the global North. Because I did actually read 1 book by a Caribbean author. So that means 2% of the literature I read was from Australia, 2% from South America, and 2% from the Caribbean. So from a sort of like reflective, evaluative sense, right? I would say I'd give myself like an A in terms of gender. I would give myself a B in terms of race. And I would give myself like a D in terms of maybe even a straight up F in terms of geography. Yeah, like 80-20 is like, that doesn't sit right with me, you know, like I would want at least like 65-45, maybe 60-40, 50-50, like, you know. So I haven't done a good job in terms of reading from the global South. And maybe I will make more of a conscious effort to do that next year, right? I don't know. I'm very hesitant to sort of be like prescriptive about how much I should be reading and from what, because then at that point you just kind of get into this sort of almost like tokenist approach where it's like, oh, Prachi, you're not reading Indigenous literature enough, so you need to go to the library and check out a bunch of Indigenous literature to make yourself seem like you're diverse. And it's like, well, no, like I checked out The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones because it was just an interesting premise, you know, and that's why I want to read it. I think when you force yourself to read something purely for diversity points, it kind of very quickly like veers into like uncomfortable tokenism and like virtue signaling. But at the same time, and this is like a debate that we had really frequently in sort of my Latin American studies classes and in my sort of like census classes, if you don't measure something, you can't know, right? Unless you sort of like measure that and take a look at it, you're never going to really be able to like take action or change. So yeah, you know, like I can set some, you know, personal goals to read more translated works and more works by authors in the global South, but I'm not going to be like super prescriptive about it. And with luck, because I make some slightly more intentional choices when I sit down at the end of December 2022 to look back on all of the books that I read in 2022, I will be more satisfied with the sort of like macro stats breakdown that I do next year. Because honestly, it's just about like, do I personally feel good about how much I've read and what kinds of books I've read this year? And as I've expressed in this video that I thought would be short, but definitely is not short, there are definitely some areas for improvement that like I've identified, but also some areas where I'm like, okay, you did good, Prachi. You did good. And honestly, that is my attitude towards all of 2021. It's like, you fucking made it. You did good in some places, you graduated, you did well, you got a job, it's okay, you're fine. But it's not like life couldn't be a hell of a lot better. It's not like there's absolutely no room for improvement, what with the madness still going on in the world. Better than 2020? Definitely. Still not great? Definitely. But yeah, that's everything from me, folks. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have an amazing, incredible new year. Thank you for sticking it out with me in 2021. Bye.